point of a battleground to give ample warning. Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. So, you've decided to join many others in the world of Azeroth as it was in 2004 to 2007, referred to as Vanilla or Classic. I'm sure you have many questions, the biggest of them probably being, what class should I play? As you would imagine, classes have changed and evolved in a huge way over the years, almost unrecognizable from Classic to current. So in this video, I'd like to give a brief rundown of each one and go over their roles, responsibilities, niches, perks, and just how they play it as a whole. Now, this is a pretty exhausted subject on YouTube, I think. Class guides are all over the place, but something I've noticed is that they're usually more aimed for the hardcore audience, with most of the talk being about the endgame and tier lists for DPS, healing, or tanking, aimed more at people who maybe played on private servers in the past several years, or at least have a base knowledge of the game in its vanilla state. So since that's been covered with people much more knowledgeable than I, for this video, I want to take a much more casual approach, assuming that the last time you played Classic was 12 years ago, or maybe you never had the chance to play it at all. I'll go over each class in the endgame and talk about their responsibilities and what roles that they generally landed in, but I won't go super detailed and get into spreadsheets or anything like that. So, if you're looking for a very high-level guide with class rankings and whatnot, you probably won't find this video very helpful. But if you just had the thought of, I'm not sure what class I want to play, let me search YouTube, this might be helpful to you. At least that's what I hope. The first thing I'll say is that each of these classes in the game have very specific roles that only they can fill. It's one of the more defining aspects of vanilla actually. Today, things have sort of melded together. Most classes are capable of really good AoE DPS, or maybe back then it was the mage's specialty, and today most classes have some form of stun, which was primarily a rogue attribute back then. Everyone is super mobile, has oh crap buttons, big DPS cooldowns. Everyone can do everything basically. This wasn't the case back then, and it has its good sides and downsides. A downside obviously is that the balance is questionable. There were certain specializations that you rarely saw because it was still the early stages, and a lot of this was still experimentation. But a good side was that the roles that you could fill were the roles that you could fill, no one else. It gave you more value and a sense of identity. People saw different classes join, and they reacted differently. It was something like, oh cool, a warlock, now we can summon, and we also have that handy soulstone if we wipe. Or, oh nice, a shaman, now we get to have that party-wide wind fury buff. I can guarantee you that this will be one of the first things that you notice if you pick up Classic, and it's part of what made it so special back then. Before we get into the classes though, I should also go over how talents worked, since I'll be mentioning specializations quite a bit. Talents back then were much different. You didn't outright pick a specialization which gave you certain spells. You had access to 90% of your class's abilities regardless of the spec, and putting points into certain trees would just increase the power of those abilities. For example, as a mage who has more points in the Frost tree, you still have Fireball, Fire Blast, Scorch, and Flame Strike and whatnot, but they just won't be as powerful as they would be if you had more points in the Fire tree. So, later on, if I say Fire Mage or whatever, try to disassociate that with today's system where for the most part, Fire Mages just have fire spells, or only Assassination Rogues have poisons. Your toolkit is tied to your class, not your specialization. I just wanted to mention that since it's one of the more confusing things for those who never played before the Cataclysm expansion. So, in no particular order, let's start with the Warlock. This is a pure DPS class that specializes in shadow and fire magic, and is supported with a wide variety of curses and other afflictions to wear down and debilitate your foes. You also have access to a varied selection of demons to accompany you in your journeys, each with their own role to fill. Your 3 specializations are Affliction, Destruction, and Demonology. Affliction improves your damage over time effects to give your enemies a slow but steady death, and Destruction more focuses on your big hitter spells such as Shadow Bolt or the instant cast Shadow Burn, a more direct way of dealing damage with big crits and much more volatility compared to Affliction. And as for Demonology, as you'd guess, this improves your ability to summon demons, increasing their health, damage, and much more. As for your roles, Warlocks are the ultimate wingman class. They're just great to have in the party. They're the only ones who can summon allies, which is especially important back then, since meeting stones did summon, and with no flying, traveling was much more cumbersome in general. Their Soul Stone was quite unique and much more valuable back then as well. Only this and Druids had the ability to resurrect during combat, although back then you had to apply the Soul Stone before the target died, so sort of a preemptive battle res. Most of the time though, you just threw it on a healer, and they only used it after a wipe so they could res up and save everyone a run back. They're also the only class that can reliably crowd control elementals with their Banish spell, which was castable in combat and has no cooldown. You pretty much needed Warlocks for the Gar fight back then in the Molten Core. He had a bunch of mini elementals running around, and unless you had a bunch of tanks, it would be wise to have a few Warlocks on Banish duty. They arguably have the most useful debuffs in the game, with curses that reduce the resistances of enemies, so all of your spellcasters can pump out more damage. Their free spell is one of the better crowd controls, particularly for PvP. It's castable in combat and at range with no cooldown, and it didn't immediately break on damage, which made it very tough to deal with. And another defining spell is their Life Tap, which trades life for mana. Mana management wasn't just a thing for healers back in the day. DPS also had to use their resources wisely, or risk being unable to cast anything. Today, most DPS classes have it just to have it. It's inconsequential 99% of the time. The one exception, I think, is the Arcane Mage. So, if mana management isn't something that you're too keen on, Warlock is a great choice for this spell alone. It gave them an edge over other casters in the game. They could also make Hellstones, which were just as valuable back then as they are today. Vital to have, but realistically, you'd save them for the tanks because they required soul shards to make. Which brings me to my next point. A quirk with Warlocks back then was that their soul shard system wasn't tied to your character like how it is now. Rather, it's an inventory item, and to gather them, you have to be draining the soul of the target when it died. Certain spells require these soul shards to cast. The Ritual of Summoning, Hellstones, Soulstones, every demon summon, excluding the Imp, and even combat spells such as Soulfire and Shadowburn. These took up an inventory slot, and back then, as infamous as it was, they didn't stack, so you're constantly playing this game of keeping an ample amount of these shards to make sure that you can cast all of your spells and make your stones and whatnot, and at the same time trying to save space for quest items and loot. So, some will find that aspect frustrating, but they're just so useful to have that it's completely worth it, I find. If your goal is to make friends in this game, I always say to make a tank, a healer, or a warlock. Any of those, and your friends list should fill up pretty quickly, because people will always want you around. So, for endgame, you're a great support class, and you have great prospects in both PvE and PvP. Rating-wise, you are hindered a fair amount due to the debuff slot limit. Back then, your whole raid was limited to 16 debuffs on one target, so being a class that has a wide variety of range over time spells and other debuffs, you may feel quite restricted in the raiding scene. If your focus is raiding, I think most Warlocks drift away from the Affliction tree in particular because of this limit, and they still do alright for themselves. But again, that's mainly raiding we're talking about here. Casual dungeons and PvP, it's no holds barred, so you're free to do whatever you want. Because of this, you're quite deadly in the PvP scene, You just have so many
Matilda's men
choices of
closed in
abilities to
and finally
cripple or
captured
encumber
King
your
Stephen.
enemies, and with mastery of all of your demon summons, you could overcome nearly any obstacle. So, just a great utility class, while still having some bite for actual DPS, which is why I like
Matilda's
him so
forces
much.
had won the Battle
Since
of
we're
Lincoln.
talking about DPS here though,
But the
another
fight for the
hugely different
crown
thing
was
in
not
Classic
over
we
yet.
need to talk about.
A counterweight trebuchet was the king of all siege engines. A catapult capable of smashing down castle walls from great distances. At Warwick Castle in England, they've built a replica, one of the largest in the world. Originating in 7th century China, by the 13th century, trebuchets had evolved into devastatingly powerful weapons.
Such a simple design, but so effective.
It has several key features. A pivoted arm with a weight at one end, and a sling to hold the projectile at the other. To prime, the 6-ton weight is raised using tread wheels.
So this is one of the wheels, one of two that's attached to an axle, which would lift the counterweight, weighing 6 tons. It's based on muscle power alone. What's essential about launching a projectile as far as possible is making sure that this end of the arm is moving as fast as possible. So once that weight drops, it really sends this point of the arm moving at its highest velocity.
This was done by positioning the pivot close to the counterweight and by launching the projectile from a sling. When released, the sling whips round, vastly increasing the launch speed. Trebuchets were carefully aimed, like modern guns.
In order to weaken the castle walls or even breach them, you had to make sure that the projectiles hit the same spot every single time.
For each projectile to follow the same trajectory, they all had to be the same weight and shape. To achieve this, masons used a gauge.
Now I'm going to load this projectile into the sling. This one must weigh about 25 kilograms, but some projectiles can get up to 150 kilograms. That's the weight of 2 men.
Trebuchets were also used to throw burning tar, beehives, even dead bodies. Anything to cause maximum distress to the enemy.
Did you hear that whoosh?
It was the counterweight trebuchet's lethal combination of power and accuracy that made it the ultimate medieval siege weapon. Victory over King Stephen at Lincoln gave Matilda the upper hand in her fight for the English crown. But in the years that followed, fragile loyalties shifted, and under threat of capture, Matilda was forced to retreat. As her holdings in England came under attack from the king's army, it fell to her son Henry to keep Matilda's claim to the throne alive. Inside the strong stone walls of the castle at Wallingford, Matilda's men held firm against a brutal siege by forces loyal to King Stephen. King Stephen's army had constructed a fortified perimeter outside the castle, trapping Matilda's men inside. However, reinforcements were on the way from Matilda's son Henry. Her forces needed to hold the walls until they arrived.
Reaper railings aren't ongoing.
One of the servants shouted. Jeppe Meyerbot. Yarwe Shelton. Boy is the boom. Jeppe Meyerbot.
See they to work.
Shelton.
Hoping to claim Wallingford, King Stephen's siege forces launched a renewed attack on the castle.
It's an odd boy. Pressen jou aanweg. Asterias.
Ik kan doen dat zo. Ik kan doen dat wel.
Yarwe Shelton.
Yare to dance and worker.
Jeppe Meyerbot.
Arita, what is it worker?
Yarwe Shelton.
See they to worker.
King Stephen's forces breached the wall and pushed into Wallingford. Matilda's men needed to repel the enemy before the castle fell and their cause was lost. Hoping to crack the mighty stone walls of Wallingford, King Stephen's forces launched another attack.
Readers, besta späder. Ich follow Hestes.
Matilda's forces repelled the attack and held the castle.
Readers, ready for Hestes. Jeppe med och bort. Boa is the boot. Dresse snäppet nuhet arveimen. Boa is the boot. Wele Marcus arveimen. Yahweh Shet.
What needeth be undone?
Estes snäppet Boa is the boot.
Ik kan veel dit dat voor dig. Hoeveel waren die ready? Ik kan hebben dat die beelden een hond.
Matilda's forces held firm against the attack, cutting down the enemy soldiers.
Ik wil hebben dat die beelden een hond. Ik breng al genoeg. Verder. Ja, weet je dat? Ik wil beelden dat voor dig.
It's in Chetandu.
Matilda's forces received word. that Henry's troops were getting closer to Wallingford. Soon the combined numbers of the two armies could tip the scales in their favour.
It's in Shendeus!
Over the John. Yeah, så är det heter. Större thot där, Henry John.
At last, Henry's reinforcements approached Wallingford. United under Matilda's banner, the two armies were ready to engage Stephen's forces.
What day did work? But that's so
Henry and Matilda's forces struck out at the besieging army, weakening the enemy's hold on Wallingford's perimeter. The enemy line wavered as Matilda's forces cut down the besieging army, clearing another section of the blockade.
Build end day that, return. nu.
Jede Hestes! What Yeah, så inte här. Jag tror visst att hon får... What beyond this?
Inside the strong stone, King Stephen's army had constructed a fortified perimeter outside the castle, trapping Matilda's men inside. However, reinforcements were on the way from Matilda's son Henry. Her forces needed to hold the walls until they arrived.
Hestes and Osborne, man. Asteria, Brante Highwaymen.
You're rated on some worker. What needed? God Swinkera, be May. Balding Don, Hitlock is good. See fate to worker. Arita, what needeth worker?
Hoping to claim Wallingford, King Stephen's siege forces launched a renewed attack on the castle.
Men of arms, leader. You're rated on some work. What needed? Jonas, you're rated on.
Reader is he'll do that.
See fate to work, yeah?
Yefe mayor, but
Hoping to crack the mighty stone walls of Wallingford, King Stephen's forces launched another attack.
Yarway chef.
No one is improved.
Hestes Come in May, friends. The frustrate Hey, soon they head.
What's the French highwaymen? What's winter before that is before?
Yarway chef. Die Beste?
Hallo, Jeff. Reader.
Min sfera is Yara.
Matilda's forces held firm against the attack, cutting down the enemy soldiers.
What day did there's a two folk? A stirreth down who? I think they listen. We have a steadest to be, two folk. Ik kan hebben dat die belden en on.
See if he'll do that now. Ferende
Matilda's forces repelled the attack and held the castle.
Ik wil building that for now.
Spada is Yara.
Be ready for this. Ending on the high.
What will eat?
One minute. Easy move.
See thing to work at. Post it down. Voice and Yare to friendly sewer hat.
Boa, easy move.
King Stephen's forces breached the wall and pushed into Wallingford. Matilda's men needed to repel the enemy before the castle fell and their cause was lost.
Ik wil happy that he building an on.
Mangara awaiting Heston. Oh, yeah, Ben Mayer. Wait, Heston.
Jahre unto a marker.
On Flaminites. Gary. Good.
What needeth be undone? I think Harry Pirende Thien Hester. Ik wil building. What needeth be undone? Yeah, Suicide Heston.
Something to Shetton.
Ik wil happy that he building an on.
What will thou?
Two cuts. Ura Heston.
We haven't stairness to be to vote.
Estes for this region, Credenda
Matilda's forces received word that Henry's troops were getting closer to Wallingford. Soon the combined numbers of the two armies could tip the scales in their favor.
Something to Shetton.
Get him to Swinken to. I think they lister. Building they that Rita knew.
Caesar engine yard.
Jiffer mij weer. Sperremen, ja.
Spanner on the loaded.
At last, Henry's reinforcements approached Wallingford. United under Matilda's banner, the two armies were ready to engage Stephen's forces.
So are they hetting? He'll go and flock a wooder. Here end 18 Hester. This is Mal.
See they to work.
See they to work.
Toonfolk already ready.
Bay off your to Hester's, Toonfolk. What needeth Bay on Toonfolk astereth Yownu?
Yet be ready for Hestes, for Warde Frankes, mit Baldenes. Gegen Jahre Armes, for Ferret.
Henry and Matilda's forces struck out at the besieging army, weakening the enemy's hold on Wallingford's perimeter.
No Hestes and on back will be on door.
Every Chianyana, travail to dawn, Carabanis.
Every charn and see fate to fair and uten every charn. Get it? We are fair and uter, Toonfolk. Aye. It'll do that now. We have steaders to bay, Toonfolk. We are fair and uter, Toonfolk.
Look at you be at me no word. Fed.
Who stay Tulkas?
It is sit readeth no Tulkas. It's libe to Vigere. For Warde Freckles, mit Baldenes.
Tüte ist kaputt.
enemy line wavered as Matilda's forces cut down the besieging army, clearing another section of the blockade. Matilda's forces overwhelmed the enemy and cleared the castle's perimeter. The joint forces of Matilda and Henry had thwarted King Stephen's siege of the strategic castle at Wallingford. After over a decade of conflict, Matilda's claim to the throne was still alive. Victory over King Stephen at Lincoln gave Matilda the upper hand in her fight for the English crown. But in the years that followed, fragile loyalties shifted, and under threat of
Oh, nice.